Well, it's got to be one of the highlights of the day, I think, because I understand that when Dr. Nick Smith is going to be talking to us, he's got something up his sleeve which is going to be exceedingly exciting for not only we in this room, but everybody else in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, please a big hand for the Minister of Housing, Dr. Nick Smith.
Kia hui tata katoa. Can I thank you, Rob, for the introduction. I always get really nervous when people introduce me as Dr. Smith, because when I first arrived in Parliament, it was in the days of Sir Robert Muldoon, and he said there's only two sorts of doctors that make you well and doctors that make you sick. I hope the former is what I share with you this afternoon. My interest, somewhat unusual in the trade of politics, was in geotechnical engineering. And again, in my early parliamentary days, with some of my research work being in the area of liquefaction, my colleagues used to sarcastically note that that was where engineers drank lots of liquids. Thankfully, more of my colleagues understand the challenges that go with that, and sadly the city has had too much of that in dealing with some of the enormous challenges. Can I compliment Lyle and the organisers of this Seismics and the City Forum? It's really important with the challenges the city has across, whether it be central and local government agencies, whether it be the private sector, right across the board, our research institutions, our universities, that we're able to significantly step up the pace of which we communicate, of which we share ideas, of which we engage, given the scale and the pace that we need to move with the rebuild of this great city. I want to cover quite specifically the scale and the initiatives around the housing area, albeit, Rob, I think you might have overcooked a little some of the specific announcement that I have today. Because the first overall message I have in terms of housing is, if anybody's looking for the single magic bullet that is somehow going to be able to replace the thousands of houses, it simply does not exist. It's about doing a whole lot of stuff smart and well and at pace that is going to be able to restore, both in terms of quality and quantity of housing that this city requires. In broad terms, we've lost 15,000 houses directly from the quakes. That number shifts a bit as the work narrows down which houses are repairable and those that should be demolished and replaced. In addition, we have 94,000 houses that are damaged, that requires repair, and the part of the housing equation that is putting extra pressure on is that as people need to temporarily dislocate from those houses as they are repaired, that increases the amount of demand in that housing space. And then a third pressure is the fact that we have a very substantive construction workforce locating here, bringing an extra pressure on the demand of housing. The answer, in a way, is that whether it be private sector, whether it be government, whether it be council, or that growing sector of community housing, we just need to move at pace on all four of those areas, getting as much housing built as quickly as possible, albeit consistent with the sorts of presentations that you've heard earlier today in other areas, is making sure that as we do that, we take the opportunity to make Christchurch a better place with the innovation, with the energy efficiency, and those other features that we would want of our housing stock. It's important around the housing debate that you also understand that there is streams of work that are occurring alongside the earthquake recovery that are also having a substantive effect on the way in which we progress with housing policy. The first of those is that the government on the 15th of April is bringing into effect the most significant change in public policy around the provision of social housing in more than a generation. As of the 15th of April, rather than just Housing New Zealand being eligible for those generous income-related rents that cost the government $700 million a year, we will be opening up those subsidies to other community organisations, which means that there will be a far more diverse range of providers of community housing, and that is one of the areas I want to make a small but step announcement in that space. Alongside that, to work as well is a pretty ambitious government program of work around improving the affordability of housing nationwide. And that is in terms of the Productivity Commission that delivered a very substantive report in 2010 that raised some very serious questions for New Zealand around our land supply policy, around the way in which we fund infrastructure, around building materials costs in New Zealand, around the compliance costs as well as the productivity in the building sector, all of which are being applied nationwide and are as another stream of change that Christchurch needs to address in dealing with its housing changes. Now, the first and immediate demand for government has been the way in which it's responded to the temporary housing needs of those families displaced. That is why very early in stage we had the temporary villages built at the Kaipoi Domain, Linwood Park and Rafiti Domain. The model then was to work with local government and to find parks and reserves in areas where there was particularly high demand for temporary housing and to build housing on those sites that would be rented out to families while their homes were repaired. It's been tremendously successful, albeit, as whenever you respond to emergencies of this sort, the economics of it has proved not as good as actually the government building temporary housing that would then translate into permanent housing. That is why last year, rather than building another temporary accommodation village, but still responding to that temporary need, the government made the choice to invest in the Rangers Park development, which has also proved successful, and with the Canterbury Emergency Temporary Accommodation Service, those houses on those 4 villages is getting a very high level of usage. For me, the number one priority is to expand that provision of temporary accommodation. If I look at the rental information that I am obtaining through my ministry, the area that is quite ugly is where we have families that require a temporary home for 3, 4 or 5 months while their home is being repaired and paying extremely high rents for that short-term period. That is also then creating a broader expectation within the private rental market that rents of $700, $800, $900 a week are ones that the market can sustain, and that's having a flow-on impact through the rest of the private housing rental market in Christchurch. And that is why for government the expansion of those temporary accommodation solutions is our highest priority and where you can expect our next move. Alongside that is in the early stages of the recovery, the demand for that temporary housing accommodation was for those families that had relatively minor repairs to their house. The recovery stage is moving to where more of the homes that are being repaired are those that are the 100,000 plus. They require a longer period of absence, and that is also feeding into the challenge we have around temporary accommodation. In terms of the longer term affordability of housing, there's this sort of intense political argument that to me is a bit of a waste of space, and that is, do you call it a crisis or do you call it a challenge? And you can put an awful amount of energy into that sort of definitional argument. Frankly, I don't give a hoot. I just want to get on and make sure we move at pace across the areas of different housing. The first and the most important, and we must never lose sight, is that the bulk of housing in Christchurch is privately owned or remain so, and the bulk of the housing solution is going to come from the private sector. And the most important things for government and council to do is to get the land use regulation, to get the building consent processes, to get the provision of skilled staff and the necessary expertise focused on rebuilding the private sector component of Christchurch housing. Relative to political energy, far too much energy goes into the complementary bits that are provided either by council or government or community housing. We must never lose sight that actually it is the private sector that is going to be the dominant player, and any interventions that involve the council or government, we need to be careful that we are not displacing that core private sector growth that is critical. I am hugely encouraged that in the last 12 months the building consent figures for the city show a level of residential housing build that is higher than at any time in the city. It's approaching the level of Auckland, and in my view is still going to need to pick up if we are going to recover the housing stock of this city in a timely way. The single biggest barriers to achieving those goals has been, firstly, the issue of land use planning. That is, that there has been some quite perverse incentives created around the way in which land access is regulated that drives up and makes less affordable the housing for families not just in the city but New Zealand wide. There's almost this sort of perverse culture that where on the one hand people damn urban sprawl, but in the next breath when you propose an intensification of housing in their suburb and their leafy street, they talk almost out of both sides of their mouths and stand in the way of addressing the issues of supply. I'm hugely encouraged by the work that's gone into the land use recovery plan that provides for a most liberal land supply market of anywhere in New Zealand and is pivotal to us being able to replace the housing and for the city to grow forward. I think the ambition for Canterbury and for Christchurch should actually be to have the most affordable housing in Christchurch, and the decisions that are made by both the regional and councils, territorial authorities around that land use regulation will play a pivotal role in that affordability. The second regulatory issue that has been huge is the difficulties, particularly with the City Council, around the questions of building permit regulation. There is a very real tension that flows not just in the housing area, but in terms of making sure that while we go at pace, that we go with quality. In our view, and we intervened last year in the City Council around the building permit systems, I'm encouraged by the numbers and I actually commend the work that both Council and the Commissioner has done with the Council to get those roadblocks sorted that are critical to the recovery. I've said quite plainly that private sector around the housing is the most important, but I do not want to understate the important role that Housing New Zealand plays in this rebuild of housing need in the city. Of Housing New Zealand's homes, 90% of them have been damaged through the earthquakes. We, in my view, very encouragingly managed to reach the insurance settlement last year of the $240 million and are moving at pace through the exercise of repairing those houses that can economically be done so, and also building an additional 700 houses. Housing New Zealand is on target to deliver those, and that is effectively a new house in Christchurch every single working day from now through to the end of 2015. Complementary to that is the huge repair program that Housing New Zealand is also advancing at pace, and they have entered into a number of significant contracts with the private sector on getting those repairs done. The real challenge with Housing New Zealand is in Christchurch, as in most parts of New Zealand, we are over-endowed with three-bedroom houses when actually for our families the needs have changed, where there's far higher demand for 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 bedroom homes, and there is a real opportunity as we move through with Housing New Zealand on that redevelopment to be able to change our social housing in this city so it better matches need. If I have a challenge for the private sector, it is to also work with Housing New Zealand on the opportunities for redevelopment and an intensification of that housing. In simple terms, Housing New Zealand is looking for partners where we have 3 or 4 old, grotty, cold, damp houses on big sections, replacing that with 3 or 4 times the intensity of housing, Housing New Zealand being returned with that modern, smaller houses, but also quite deliberately in the process moving to mixed neighbourhoods where we have in those areas a greater intensity of housing, but also a mix of social housing and affordable housing that can be done with the private sector, and I would encourage those to participate in that. There is a further challenge that I need to share with you in terms of the government's broader housing affordability program, of which there are 2 particular dimensions I want to raise today. The first of those is in terms of the way in which our local authorities charge their development contributions. If you look at the Productivity Commission's report on housing affordability in New Zealand, the single item that has gone up more than any other over the last decade is the degree of those council charges. And equally so, if we look at the comparisons between house costs in New Zealand and Australia, again, those development contributions are one of the areas that is making our homes more expensive. There is a hard political call that needs to be made, and as part of a bill that we currently have before Parliament, that puts a constraint on council in the degree to which they can dump costs onto developers and subsequently homeowners with those development tools. I'm an ex-local government politician. I started my political apprenticeship at the Rangiora District Council in this region. If you're a local body politician and you've got the choice of putting a cost on rates or putting on developers, it's a no-brainer as to where you'd want to lump it. But the reality is that that culture results in excessive costs being put on the price of new sections, that translates into the costs of the new housing, and that raises the whole tide of house prices in a community. And that is why the government, through that legislation, and by July, will be putting a tighter constraint on what those charges can be for, and will be providing for an independent appeal process to ensure that they are supporting the government's broader program of improving housing affordability. A third and very challenging issue is the issue of building materials and those costs. Our concern is that the small housing market and broader building construction market we have in New Zealand means that there are some lack of competition and choice in the building materials market that requires reform if we are going to be able to get the best price possible of quality materials to support the rebuild. We'll shortly be announcing changes in that space. One of the debates that we are dealing with is the level of tariff that is provided on imported building material and some anti-dumping duties that is making the materials involved in Christchurch rebuild more expensive than they need to be. Now, some of you will be familiar with the work that our government has done with the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas legislation that is particularly targeted at the issues we have in Auckland. I'm currently in negotiations with both the Wellington and Christchurch Council around how we can use that same accord mechanism to get the mechanisms of our Christchurch City Council and of government working better to be able to support the housing challenges. Unlike Auckland, where the strong focus is on housing supply of land, the focus of the discussions with the Christchurch City Council are far more in the social and affordable housing space, where we both collectively have major challenges, and I'm hopeful in being able to conclude those negotiations and to have an announcement in the next month or two. The last area that I want to cover today reflects both the demands of the earthquakes and the housing sector in Christchurch and the government's ambition for building a stronger sector of community housing providers. With that reform that comes into place on the 15th of April and the contestability that will then be available on the government's social housing support of about $700 million a year, there is a strong block of community organisations that are wanting to provide for that social housing. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Sue McKenzie from the Canterbury Community Trust, who I'll ask to make a few comments alongside as to the strength that can be given by community housing organisations. I've heard word said that the Canterbury Community Trust was established for Christchurch's rainy day. Well, it's had a big rainy day, and it has been incredibly generous of the Canterbury Community Trust to come forward with $10 million to sit alongside the government's 139 to grow that community housing sector. The very specific announcement that the government is making today is that we've approved housing for a further 75 community houses across the city of Christchurch. Our partners in those developments is the concept of Abbey Fields, which is a British concept of old people's flatting, where people are able to share a home and share a carer. It also is Vision West, a substantive social housing provider that is keen to establish itself in Christchurch, as well as Comcare for those four organisations to be able to establish 75 community houses with a grant from the joint fund that's been established with the Canterbury Community Trust and through the provision of $14 million. In my view, growing that community housing sector is particularly important for dealing with those most at risk, people with disabilities, people in lower socioeconomics groups who are particularly feeling the hardship of the housing challenges that this city faces. On that note, I'll ask Sue McKenzie from the Community Trust to make a few comments about this partnership with government.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Smith. I'm too scared to call him doctor after that thing. Just a brief promo on the Canterbury Community Trust. because we have been around for decades in Christchurch, and we've been giving away roughly $18 million a year through donations to various sectors. The rest of the time, the trustees spend trying to make money so we can give away those 18 million. But today, a little dream has come true. We all know the earthquakes, what happened. It became really apparent business as usual was not going to work, particularly in the social housing sector, where we'd lost so many units and people were in need. So we got together with the social housing unit and various community providers and the trust decided to break into their capital reserves, whip out 25 million and give it to Christchurch under various guises, because Christchurch damn well needed the money. And today we've just announced, as Minister Smith has said, this other continuing partnership with existing community providers who have the resources to do the wraparound services, because it's all very well putting up roofs and beds and parking and what have you, but unless we can actually support the people at that level with wraparound services and pull the whole thing together in a package and make it sustainable. In the past years, the Trust has given money to housing. We've given you money, take it, build a house, goodbye money. This is a slightly more sustainable kind of operation where we can make our money go further by collaboration. We get the economies of scale, we get the great service providers wrapping it around, and we can meet the need of the community. And it's just lovely to be able to say today, since we first launched the first part of the fund, which was February last year, we now have the first building completed with the first family in it under the Habitat for Humanity umbrella. We have another 11 underway with all the consenting bits done. And this is just one of the 7 organisations, 8, that we have actually dealt with. And we have 20 families targeted for the 21 places all ready to go the moment we can get those roofs up. And that is thanks to the government funding, putting in their bulk, ours, and these community providers. So we're small, but we're there, and we've actually done something, and we've actually got a roof over someone's head. Thank you.